Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the World Discord Podcast. I'm Brian Endless.
I'm Joel Ostra.
That's good. You caught your cue that time, Joel.
Yeah.
That's important.
It only takes 9 episodes. Finally, we got it right now. Yeah.
We are here today to come back to Russia again. It's obviously a gigantic country, a gigantic topic, has huge influence on the world. And it has not been in the news as much lately because, of course, our news follows the shiny object. We've just spent a lot more time on Israel and Gaza. And now the last week or so, we've spent a lot more time on internal U.S. politics, we being the U.S. media. We want to go into more depth on Russia today. And we actually want to cover something that I personally am convinced most Americans know nothing about. And it's something we really should understand. And that is the question of where is Russia coming from? Where is Putin coming from? When we talk about foreign governments and how they make decisions, we act, whether we know it or not, as if we understand their perspective, as if we understand what the country is going to do and where the leaders' heads are at. And I think that the more I look at it, the more I see that we have a woeful lack of understanding. So one of the things we're doing on this podcast in general, and specifically today on Russia, is to try to provide more depth on that. We have a special guest who's a Russia expert here, and I'm going to turn it over to Joel to introduce him.
Thank you, Brian. And our guest is Brian Taylor, political science professor at Syracuse University. Really, really glad to have you with us, Brian. Brian and I have known each other for 35 years at least. I'd say got to know each other best, although we studied together at MIT. We got to know each other in Moscow when we were both doing our dissertation research. And I just want to let everyone know, Brian Taylor is a serious scholar. When I was living in Moscow, I had my mother send me books, and she would send me collections of Dickens's work, of Mark Twain, those kinds of works. And Brian also got stuff from his mom. He had her record onto VHS tapes episodes of Beavis and Butthead, which we consumed eagerly and completely.
That Brian, actually sounds like a really good primer for Russian politics from what I know about it. So that's good. I'm sure that works.
Well, the vodka was probably more useful for that. But Brian, early in your career, right, was expert on the Russian military. I remember you wrote a lot about civil-military relations in Russia. And just so the audience is aware, when we had a little back and forth, Brian was sort of disavowing his expertise in the Russian military today. But as you know, the reality is I probably know more about the Russian military than maybe 99% of the population, and you know more about the Russian military than 99.8% of the population. So, but I think most relevant for this conversation, even though it might diverge a little from the content of your last book, The Code of Putinism, which, by the way, I guess I will tell you again in this format. The last time I taught my course on Russian politics, pairing my book on the rise of Putin's dictatorship with yours on the contours of the Russian political system today really worked well. Although we didn't communicate so much when you were working on your book, I just thought they pair together really well seamlessly, which at least for me, I'm grateful for, because you certainly cover the current period. So I'd really like to start with, I'm really interested in your take on a pretty simple question, and it springs from one that we talked quite a lot about back in the 90s, with the bungled invasion of Chechnya. How do you explain the catastrophic failure of Russia's invasion of Ukraine from the beginning? Like, how do you make sense of the gulf between probably what they and we anticipated and what happened?
Great. Thanks for that, Brian and Joel. It's great to be here. It's good to be on with Joel again. Not only did we watch Beavis and Butthead, but we watched Twin Peaks on Russian TV in dubbed
Twin
in
Peaks.
yes, dubbed in Russian.
Yes.
Yeah, the first time I saw that show, it was all dubbed in Russian, and it was just as wild in Russian as it was in English.
Yeah.
But to get to your question about the full scale Russian invasion in February 2022, yes, I think you were correct that both on the Russian side and actually on the US government side, people were surprised that the invasion was much less successful than many people had anticipated. If we want to figure out why, I think we have to think about it both in political terms and then in military terms. So, starting with the political, because I think this is probably the biggest part of the story, I think the failure stemmed most of all from Putin's belief and the belief of the people around him that Ukraine was not a real nation, that it was not a legitimate state, that its leadership had been imposed by the United States on an unwilling Ukrainian population that really wanted to embrace Russia and was being prevented from doing so by this imposed leadership. This is in Putin's worldview I'm talking about. And they also didn't take the Ukrainian military as a fighting force seriously. We know based on subsequent reporting that the Federal Security Service, the main successor to the KGB, was telling Putin that they had everything wired, that uh, they were going to have widespread support. They would be greeted as liberators, as the expression went from the US invasion of Iraq, and that they had people in place who were willing to become the new Russian puppet government. And all of that was wrong. And so they drew up an invasion plan based on the idea that they simply had to quickly seize Kiev, arrest or kill Zelensky, and then everything would flow their way. They did not expect the degree of resistance that the Ukrainian military experienced. And they also failed to even tell many of their own military what the plan was. Putin was obsessed with secrecy of the operation, and so much was not communicated down the chain of command. This is kind of ironic because the US knew exactly what was coming and had great intelligence on not only when the invasion was coming within a rough window, but actually what the plan was. So that information was shared with the Ukrainians, and so they were ready for it. And a lot of the invading force, they were just given these very simple and incredibly ambitious objectives. In 12 hours, you're supposed to be at this point, and that kind of thing. And so they just got cut to pieces. Their logistics broke down. They did not really fight according to their doctrine, which would have involved much greater use of long range fires to weaken the Ukrainian military in advance of the full scale armored onslaught. And so everything just ground down. Now, of course, they did seize important parts of Ukrainian territory, and they'd already seized some when the war really started, right in 2014, when they annexed Crimea and started a war in the southeast part of Ukraine known as the Donbass. But the full scale invasion fell far short of the objectives because of those, especially basic political misunderstandings that I talked about.
Let me stop you there for a minute, Brian, because you just raised at least a couple dozen questions in my mind of what's happening here. So, first, just to be clear, you're saying that this wasn't just propaganda, that Putin and his people really believed those things about Ukraine. More importantly, though, how do we know yet? Because I realize we may not know. Do we know yet how Russian intelligence got it so wrong?
Well,
Why were they
yeah,
so locked into this view and so separated from the reality of what was going to happen?
because my hunch, Brian, is I've always had a lot of what's the right word? Respect in faith in the FSB's ability to conduct accurate intelligence assessments. And the way I connect that understanding with nothing specific, but I guess the whole of your analysis of Putinism is that analysis didn't make it to Putin, whether out of fear or knowing what the leader wanted. It's sort of like the CIA knew that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but that didn't really make it into the Oval Office sufficiently to override the pre-existing understanding of the leadership. We don't know, I don't think, but what's your hunch on that? Both on Ukraine not being a nation and Ukraine's preparedness, but also on the realities of Russia's own military, which we'll get into.
Yeah, I think there are several things that were going on here. I would stress something I already mentioned and that Brian mentioned as well. Yes, they really believe what they say about Ukraine, how they're really part of the Russian nation, how most Ukrainians wanted to be closely aligned with Russia, how the government there was a false government imposed by a CIA coup. I think the evidence is that Putin and the people around him really believe that. And it does seem that Putin became even more obsessed with some of these ideas during the COVID pandemic when he was highly isolated and ordering documents from the archives to write a 10,000 word article on how Ukrainians and Russians have always been united. And it just seems to be clear that he and the people around him really had this view. And I think many people in the Russian elite and the Russian society have it too. But I would suspect, and we don't know as much about this, but I would suspect many people in the FSB have similar views because this is the kind of thing that they had as their historical narrative growing up in the Soviet Union and all that kind of stuff. So that's part of it, just this wrongheaded set of ideas. And I would stress here that it is wrongheaded. We have excellent polling data on Ukrainian political views after the annexation of Crimea and how public opinion, which had been more kind of split on pro-Western and pro-Russian, to simplify a great deal, but pro-Western versus pro-Russian views swung very much in the pro-Western direction after those events, and there was a increasingly consolidated sense of Ukrainian national identity after that point. But the other thing is the thing that Joel already raised, which is the nature of the political system meant that the incentives for intelligence organizations are to tell the boss what he wants to hear. It's a personalist dictatorship. It's pretty weakly institutionalized. Obviously, there are institutions and they compete with each other for Putin's favor and that kind of thing. But they've never really had a great interagency intelligence and foreign policy process where competing views are on the table, where people are
Yeah.
encouraged to be, devil's advocates and that kind of thing. So the FSB actually did have some polling data that suggested that Ukrainians would fight hard, and they chose to ignore that part of the data they had and emphasize the part that suggested that things would go easy for them. So I think it's a combination both of this imperial Russian mentality and a political system in which everything is devoted to sucking up to the czar.
And those voices that may have been more cautionary voices get silenced or self-silence given the nature of Russia's system. But so your sense though is that that there was a more unified view even within the FSB than perhaps than the picture I painted. It's interesting.
Well, I'm not sure we know about the FSB as a whole, but the directorate that
Oh,
was
sure. The term.
responsible for providing this information, uh,
Yeah.
was talking to the director of the FSB, who was talking directly
Yeah.
to Putin. So other parts of the FSB, if they had been looking at this issue and had contrary views, they would have been kept silent. But my understanding of the way the FSB works is that the other parts of it, would not have been pulled into a discussion about this. I think more interesting is what the separate intelligence agencies might have been saying. The Russian military intelligence, the
Military
foreign
intelligence.
intelligence services. We don't really know what happened there. and why, especially the chief of the general staff, went along with an invasion plan that he should have known uh, was likely to fail, or at least had a high risk of failure.
That's another thing that you raised in your earlier comment that I wanted to ask you to get into a little bit. I've done a lot of peace and security and military analysis, and one of the things that still surprises me is the lack of Russian use of their air force and of some of their more long range abilities. We know they've got Su-57s, the Gen 5 stealth fighters and fighter bombers that can do a lot of damage with very little chance of getting hit. And it seems they haven't used that, and they haven't used a lot of their long range capability. You mentioned that that would normally be a part of their plan, an invasion plan. Do we know why they didn't use that? What was the hesitancy in using that? Because that seems like that could have softened up the Ukrainians, and for people who expected it to go quickly, air power would have been an important part of that.
I don't know 100% on this issue, but there are a couple things that I would call attention to. The first is that the invasion plan was premised on a quick seizure of the country, so they didn't want to destroy a lot of infrastructure that they were hoping to use.
Which is
And
funny now to think about, right?
yes,
Yeah,
now that they're you know
Leveling the
bombing.
place.
Yeah, now that they're leveling the place, but I think the initial invasion plan was premised on, keeping all those bridges open and not destroying all the infrastructure because their guys were going to be in charge of it within a week. So that might have had something to do with it. I think Ukrainian air defense in the initial week or two, and then going forward, proved to be more robust than the Russians had planned on, and they lost some
A lot of
aircraft, and that
planes.
made them more cautious early on. And then there is the issue of pilot training. I think the word out there had been that after Syria, after right where they started getting involved in 2015, after the defense reform that started around 2009, 2010, that they were doing better in terms of things like pilot training. But it does seem that the pilot training was not good enough for them to conduct the type of integrated operations with the ground forces, especially in a nighttime context. They seem to only want to fly during the day, which of course negates some of the advantages you might think they would have had otherwise.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, if they're flying at night, then they got to drink during the day, and nobody wants to do that. Uh, let me ask you, um, because you mentioned that disconnect in military strategy. Um, it seems to reflect an incredible lack of learning on the part of the entire military and intelligence apparatus in Russia. Because isn't that exactly the same thing that happened in Chechnya 1?
Yes. Yes, they exactly. The defense minister at the time, Pavel Grachev, was saying that they were going to, seize Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in 48
Two,
hours or
right.
something
Yeah,
like
2
that.
days. Yeah.
So it's a very similar kind of thing. But I think the Russians had convinced themselves, and not without reason, I think, that they were a different military now in 2022 than they'd been in 1994 when the first Chechen invasion took place, because they'd been going through this long defense reform. They had acquired a lot of new equipment, and they had successfully annexed Crimea without having to fire a shot, and they had saved Assad's regime when they thought it might fall in 2015. So I think they had some confidence in their abilities. But what we didn't know, or maybe I should say what I didn't know, there were probably some people who knew this, the more aggressive training regimen that they had been on uh, had a lot of show to it, apparently, and they really were not adept at the type of combined arms operation that the U.S. military can run, where the infantry is integrated with the
Yeah.
armor, and both of those are integrated with the Air Force, and all of that's connected to intelligence that's real time. And apparently, they were not able to fight in that sort of modern way. And what they ended up having instead was just these long columns of tanks, which didn't even have the requisite amount of fuel available because the people didn't know the invasion was real. They thought they were on a training exercise, so they sold it on the
Uh-huh.
black market in Belarus or whatever. So they had all of those corruption problems that are endemic in the Russian military, as well as probably a great deal of overconfidence based on their underestimation of Ukraine and their underestimation of their own capabilities based on what they thought they had done to improve their capacity.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can go back to the politics for a bit.
Yeah.
And again, the question of only telling the emperor what you think he wants to hear, how important has that been ongoing? Do we have reason to believe, as a lot of people have said, that Putin is just totally isolated and surrounded by yes men and sycophants? Is he likely to be getting any real information? Is he making bad decisions, or is he just not getting all the information, so making decisions on what he's got? And are there other important people here involved in the decision making process?
So he does have multiple sources of information. He has people who work for what they call the presidential administration who will be providing him information more so on domestic politics than foreign policy, although they have a foreign policy arm. They have multiple competing intelligence services that, on some issues, provide alternative points of view. And it's probably worth emphasizing for your listeners that uh, although they have this large intelligence and security and military complex, many of these agencies hate each other and have
Yeah,
deep standing
yeah,
animosities towards each other, but they don't have what you would have in a country like the United States, where the National Security Council is meant to call together different actors and get different viewpoints on the line. And, people are free to express alternative opinions. My sense of how the Russian Security Council works is, Putin meets with them once a week and talks to his buddies about whatever he feels like talking about, and they all reassure him how things are going great. And then at the sort of more institutional level, as opposed to the leadership level, the Security Council in Russia doesn't have the ability to force these agencies to cooperate with each other. So I think those are some of the problems. Putin himself is pretty disconnected in the sense that it's been widely reported that he never gets on the internet himself. So people actually print out things from the internet to hand to him, to show him. So he doesn't go seek out information on his own. And I think it's important that during the pandemic, he pretty much self isolated for several years. And any member of the elite who was going to see him or anyone else had to quarantine for 7 days before they got in to see him. And he wasn't traveling around the globe talking to other
right.
leaders and getting different points of view. So I think the degree of groupthink and reinforcing what the czar wants to hear with his increasing time in office and increasing age just meant a very rigid worldview and a very rigid decision making process.
And you describe in describing Putinism, um, as you mentioned here, it's a personalist dictatorship uh, that is grounded in, and he consciously put this together from the day he came to Moscow. Really, what you describe as kind of a clan network of um, folks who originally came from the security services, right? The Syracuse, um, and sort of installed these people one by one at the tops of major industries and financial organizations and government positions. I wonder if you could, you mentioned in passing that there was that they'd modernized the military and the weaponry over the last decade, but it seems like during the course of this war, we've seen. Um, well, I remember, the grounded tank column a couple months after the initial invasion outside of Kiev, and I saw for myself at the UN, at an exhibit at the UN. They had MREs that with expiration dates from 2016, 2014. Um,
Well, and also getting munitions from North Korea
Well, that's
and
now,
drones from Iran.
but they're getting those now because their own munitions proved to be either old, which means that they never procured the new ones, or the new ones simply failed. And we see that even with their supposed what is it, the Su-27 now, that the newest plane, like those seem to be, they don't fly them because they get shot down by a slingshot, it seems. Um, and I just wonder, as you are looking at this reality over the last couple of years, just to the military, um, to what extent does the institutionalized corruption of Putin's dictatorship explain that? Like, clearly money was budgeted for that modernization, right? That we know that. Did all of it go to yachts and chalets in Switzerland and trips to the Maldives, or did they just build shitty stuff? Like, what happened?
Um, so yes and yes, all of the above, right? A lot of it was stolen, and there's pretty good evidence for that. I would commend to people interested in military corruption to look at the report that Navalny's team did
Oh
on
yeah,
the recently dismissed Deputy Minister of Defense Timur Ivanov, who was close to then Minister of Defense Shoigu. There's a great report on Ivanov and his family's various travels in the West,
yeah.
yachts, mansions, all of that kind of stuff, the clothes that his wife was wearing, and all of that kind of stuff. And there were
And that
even,
money had to come somewhere, right? So the
yeah.
assumption is it was pilfered from the budget, right?
Well, yeah, he was in charge of construction, which is always one of the most corrupt structures in general, but also in Russia and in the Russian military. Uh, the Russian military prosecutor actually even issued some reports saying that up to 20% of the money was being stolen, or maybe the number was even higher than that. But a lot of it was being stolen. I think
Yeah,
part of the
Tatarov has been writing about that, or was when he was still relatively safe too, for years. I don't know if you ever saw his like 3 or 4 part massive study on corruption.
I'm sorry, who did you mention?
Tatarov
Oh yeah,
from
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of that work by Russian investigative journalists and Russian social scientists, independent ones, and that kind of thing. But I think a bigger problem was maybe that Russia, and I don't like to engage in cultural stereotypes, but in terms of the Russian military, they have never really prioritized the individual soldier in terms of just providing even the basics that they need. So it's been widely reported that people will show up, if they've been recruited or, conscripted or dragooned or however they are brought into the military. And they're contacting their family, asking them to send them, body armor, boots, all of that kind of
Socks.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
socks. And I think that's a long-standing pattern where the generals tend to see themselves as a completely different class from the soldiers that they lead, and they look on them with some degree of disdain and treat them the way one might treat a dog, and not a dog that you liked, right? But a
right.
dog, that you were prepared to beat if it, wasn't behaving properly, kind of thing. So, those kind of sort of more long-standing social and cultural issues having to do with the Russian military, I think explain to a certain extent, some of the problems they've had, as well as the fact that this is, a war of colonization on their part, whereas on the Ukrainian side, they're fighting, for their independence and sovereignty and to protect, their people and their democracy. So the morale on the Russian side as compared to the Ukrainian side, for most of the war has been, completely different, I would say.
But I want to
I just
follow
want
up
to
on
be
a piece
clear.
of that.
I want
Brian,
to be
can I
clear
follow up?
here real quick.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on it.
All right, follow up.
It'll be
Go ahead.
fairly quick. So one point, that disconnect between officers and soldiers. This is not new. It's not even Soviet. This goes back to pre-Soviet times. This is endemic in the Russian military throughout history. If I understand right, I think you agree on the corruption, though. So we talked about sort of on the the military side. But would you say, and this is what was fascinating to me when you were writing about the structure of the economy under Putin, do you suspect that that also applied in the defense industries, meaning like the manufacture of armaments and even the modern armaments, that the directors of these factories and maybe even a couple layers down were also pilfering rather than building high-tech modern stuff, like sort of Boeing, like they just left out a few bolts or used broken parts and kept the money for themselves, kind of thing?
No, I think that's definitely true. The guy who's in charge of the main state arms conglomerate in Russia is a guy named Sergei Chemezov, who Putin met back in the late 1980s when they were both stationed in Dresden, East Germany, in the KGB.
Oh,
And
KGB guy,
Putin
yeah.
has this long-standing habit of placing loyalists. Joel referred to this earlier, placing loyalists who he's known for a very long time, 30, 40 years, 50 years now in some cases, in these positions of responsibility. And they're given a very long leash as long as they keep their institutions loyal. So I think uh, th- there's the longstanding issue of Russian military industry not really being adapted to sort of modern economics and production standards because there's no competition there. But also, this monopoly position with one of Putin's buddies in charge means lots of things go wrong that are never reported up the chain.
Makes sense.
I want to clarify this whole thing because you guys are in a very Russian world here. And I understand it because I've talked to a lot of experts over time, but I know most Americans don't get this. We haven't used the word kleptocracy yet. And what we're talking about is a top to bottom kleptocracy. Because, Brian, when you say steal, a lot of Americans would think, oh, somebody outside goes in and steals. This is just top to bottom corruption where effectively a part of your job, whether you're a director of a military corporation or whether you are a private in the military, you see a part of what you do as taking things and monetizing them
Enriching
to
yourself.
pay. To enrich yourself, and in the case of the lower end of the military, probably to pay yourself at all and to get your basic gear. And I just think that's so foreign to most people who will be listening to this. I want to be clear how deep that kleptocracy is and be clear that that's really what we're talking about here. I don't know if that was a question or just a
Yeah, I mean, Brian,
clarification.
like we've always heard people referring, even into the Yeltsin years, like referring to the oligarchs and they were kleptocrats, right? It's been for a long time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely true. The reason I'm hesitating a bit is because kleptocracy is the rule of thieves, and at least at the very top,
The very
Putin and
top.
his closest associates, he has stolen a lot. His buddies have all stolen a lot. That is clear, and that is one of their goals. But I don't think it's the only goal. I don't think it's just about stealing for Putin and some of the people around him. It's also about making Russia great again, the way they understand that. And so, yes, they're stealing, and I think partially they think, well, I'm a great patriot. I'm doing all these great things for Russia. Why should I not have all the mansions
Yeah,
and yachts and everything else that these
yeah.
so-called oligarchs, these business people have? I'm the true servant of Russia. I deserve at least as much as them, and really to have the status as the top boss and this I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but this mafia-like structure, the Godfather has to have more resources than
More than
everyone else
yeah.
underneath them. But
But I
yeah, we
agree
do.
with you. The motivation was different, right? Right. Their motivation was to rule, to govern, to strengthen Russia, and then like the next layer was the kleptocracy, like straight up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the fish rots from the head, as the Russian expression goes. So they're all stealing, but
Yeah.
they're not just stealing. At least
Stealing for different
not
reasons.
all of them. There are some of
It's
them, and this would include,
Mhm.
Putin and some of his closest buddies have this vision of themselves
Yeah.
as, the saviors of Russia kind of thing, while at the same time they're stealing and turning a blind eye to everyone else
Yeah.
engaging in the same activity.
Yeah, I worked with Bill Browder, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Multimillionaire billionaire who got made his money in Russia and then got on the list as somebody who is one of the major people now who complains about Russian issues. He's talked about the oligarchy and how Putin controls the oligarchs. And my understanding from him is a lot of it is Putin is a lot of Putin's theft now is simply taking percentages from the oligarchs so they can stay in power. Can you talk a little bit about that highest level of the oligarchy structure, how they stay in power, how they use their power?
So I would distinguish between the so-called old oligarchs of the Yeltsin era, people who became billionaires when privatization took place and they got control of the oil companies and the nickel companies and the steel companies and all those sorts of things. The ones who opposed Putin quickly lost their assets and occasionally their lives, and the rest of them quickly sort of fell in line. So there are still some of those quote unquote old oligarchs around, but there's the whole new group of people that Putin brought in and empowered, people he knew from St. Petersburg, people he knew from the KGB. And if you look not only in the Russian state structure, but in the Russian private and business and economic sector, many of these people are in their positions because they're cronies of Putin, right? And these actors hold different amounts of money for Putin that is funneled through the bank account of his former buddy who's the cello player or his cousin, or there are all these sort of corrupt schemes. If someone really wants to delve into this and has 2 hours, just watch the Navalny video on Putin's Palace. It's called. The name of the video is "The World's Biggest Bribe," and he breaks down, because this was obviously made before Navalny was murdered. He breaks down the way that these different actors funnel money through all these shell companies and secondary actors, in ways that eventually end up spending money so Putin could have this, huge palace that he's never actually lived in, as far as we can tell. So
Do we have a number of what Putin is worth? Is there a guess out there?
there are so
There's
many
lots
guesses.
of guesses.
there,
Yeah,
there are so many guesses out
Yeah.
there. To some extent, I'm not even sure how much it matters because he's planning on ruling till he dies, and he has an endless supply of money from the state, right? The palaces and planes and yachts that he uses are all state owned, but he's also got a lot of money set aside for a rainy day for his
Yeah.
daughters and, those sorts of things.
a lot of those ones outside the country can't use now either because the indictments from the war, like you can't go anywhere. Hey, I want to turn this back to the war for a sec, or at least tangentially. Um, it- one of the factors that really weakened Soviet power from within um, was the sort of popular movement that arose, particularly of the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, right, in the wake of Afghanistan. And it's not so much; it wasn't like a street revolution that brought down Soviet power, but that movement exposed an important part of the lie, right, of Soviet communism. And what was it? 9 years in Afghanistan. What was it? Maybe
No.
15 or 20,000 killed and wounded, and it's 20 times that in 2 years in Ukraine, and yet there isn't a whisper of of any kind of uprising like that. It's not possible that, I mean, every person in Russia knows someone who knows someone who has been killed or maimed in this war. You don't get to close to 500,000 or whatever it is. Everybody knows someone, and yet there isn't any sign even of a groundswell. And we think of Soviet power as the as Nick Danilov used to describe it, a system based on fear. Um, Clearly, fear is prevalent in Putin's Russia, but it still even surprises me that in today's Russia, there's less sign of any kind of stirring than there was back then. And I'm just curious, do you agree with that picture, and how do you make sense of that? Because I have trouble with it.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't think we have great answers for that, but let me say a couple of things. The first I would say is the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers in the Afghan War really found their footing and created a national movement after Gorbachev came to power and Glasnost had started, which means openness, right? There was a feeling of increasing liberalization in that time when they arose, and of course, when they were working, in Chechnya and against the Chechen War in the '90s, there was a lot more pluralism and a lot more openness and freedom. Now, the regime is as oppressive as it's been, since the pre-Gorbachev period. There were protests, fairly large ones, early on, and they just rounded everyone up. People could get rounded up for holding a sign that said no war. They could get rounded up for holding a sign that said thou shall not kill outside of a church, for having, a green ribbon on their backpack, which is the symbol. It's this covert symbol because it's a combination of yellow and blue, the Ukrainian colors. There's this artist from St. Petersburg who's now serving, I think, 7 years. Her name is Sasha Skachelenko. She changed the price tag in a grocery store, 5 price tags from the price to an anti-war slogan. She got 7 years for that. And so you don't need that many, show trials to convince everyone else that they should just keep their head down. We have seen a very small sort of mothers and wives attempt to mobilize around the issue of those who were forced into service from the reserves in the fall of 2022. They thought they were going to serve a year, but they're all still there if they're not dead
Yeah,
yet.
yeah.
And they've tried to organize small events, but everyone's afraid to come out, right? Obviously, there are a lot of people
So
who,
many dead and wounded. Like, what
yeah,
does it take for, that's the baffling part to me, is the numbers are overwhelming compared to them.
yeah,
Like, I don't know that there's an answer, but I get asked this all the time when I'm on the radio
yeah,
and or
yeah,
on TV, and I'd like to have an answer. Damn it.
yeah,
To
yeah.
some extent,
I
isn't
mean,
this also a question of a lot of these movements, if you look back on them, were more spontaneous and kind of groundswells that popped up and work quickly? I don't know that these movements take a lot of time to build or that we see the time while they're building, but they're underground. Can we know whether that's there or not?
I mean, there are a few small kind of underground things, but nothing that has made a dent. If I can just invoke a social science concept briefly, there's a collective action problem here, right? Which means that even if you're part of the group that opposes the war, and based on surveys, we think it's probably around 20% of the people who are opposed to the war, what is it going to benefit them? What are they going to accomplish by speaking out? They've seen what happens when people do that. They don't have any faith that they can actually achieve anything. So it's kind of a futile effort from their point of view. And from a rational perspective, for any one person to come out and try and do something, it doesn't make sense. Now, I still think Joel's question is the right one, which is how many people have to die before that changes? The former commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny, when he was reflecting on why uh, Russia was still fighting so hard and represents such a threat to Ukraine still today, 2.5 years in, he said, "My one mistake was thinking that killing 150,000 Russians would end the war." And we don't know exactly what the number is, but it's in that ballpark, right?
Yeah.
And they still keep coming, and they pay people lots of money to enlist, 10 times what they could get doing anything else. They're not recruiting them from Moscow and St. Petersburg. They're coming from the poor regions of Russia where the kind of money that people get they've never seen before, the kind of money their family gets if their husband dies is money they've never seen before, tens of thousands of dollars, which doesn't, of course, seem like a reasonable price to pay for the loss of a son or a husband. But I think the combination of the repression from the state and the sort of social expectation that you go along and people being bought off, all of those things conspire to make it very hard for people to imagine any alternative to what's happening now.
Maybe this is a good time to move into a final topic here, because I think you raised the most important question right now. Why is Russia still in Ukraine? What is Putin seeing here? What are Putin's goals? Does he have goals? Is it, as many people have talked about, including myself, linked to the US presidential elections, and he's in a wait and see until November? Where do you think we're likely to go, and what are the motivations here?
I would start by emphasizing the primary motivation for the war in the first place, which is still, I think, what's driving Putin, which he thinks he needs to control Ukraine politically. And he's been interested in that, as far as we can tell, from the beginning of his presidency. And he tried to achieve that political control in a variety of different ways over multiple decades. And eventually he concluded that the only way to really achieve that was to overthrow the government and put his person in power. So that led to the military invasion. And I think that's still the goal. That is what he wants to accomplish. He's obviously declared that he's annexed these different territories within Ukraine, which amount to about 20% of Ukrainian territory. But ultimately, the prize is Kyiv and taking control of the government. And I think that's his objective. So that's why the war goes on. And to your point, Brian, yes, I think he thinks he can outlast the US, he can outlast the West, and he can outlast Ukraine. That even though the war didn't go the way he expected it would initially, he's in this till the end, and he ultimately thinks it matters more to him than it matters to anyone else, especially in the U.S. and in Western Europe. And so ultimately, he will prevail, and he's all in on this. And I think the question is he right about that? Will eventually the United States, because of a change in political power, at the top level, or because of a loss of general support, will that support evaporate? Will Western Europe stop supporting at the level it has, which is even higher than the U.S. level on a per capita basis, or not? I don't think we know the answer to that question yet, but Putin is betting that he has more staying power than anyone else. So that those are the stakes that we face at the moment.
Right.
And
I
back
mean,
to you, what the two of you have thrown out is, it almost sounds like his staying power just depends on how many dead Russians the Russian people will accept before something happens to move him on it. Is there anything besides that that could really move him
I
at
think
this
it's
point?
beyond that, because I think if that were going to do it, I agree with Zaluzhny. Like, it seems like there isn't a number, because if there's a number, they would have exceeded it by now. Like, so if they double the number of dead and casualties, it's hard to see, like, why would suddenly that make a difference? I don't know.
Yeah. So Russia represents about 2% of the world economy and about 2% of the world population. You would think, compared to the United States, Western Europe, and other allies like Japan and South Korea, that they would have the financial resources to outlast Russia, right? I mean,
Outlast
the,
Ukraine, yeah.
the the amount that the U.S. has provided to Ukraine on a per capita basis out of our GDP, well, not on per capita, sorry, just on a GDP basis over the last 2.5 years, is about 0.2% of the total size of our economy. It's not a large amount of money out of the entire size of the U.S. economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that with the change in political leadership in Washington, that money won't completely go away, right? Um, there are some things that might impose some limits on Putin. There's the personnel issue. There's also pretty good evidence that they are chewing through armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and things like that at a rate that they cannot replace. They're pulling tanks that are 40, 50, 60 years old out of storage and trying to refurbish them and send them off to the front.
I
They're
read that
obviously,
recently. World War II era tanks now are showing up destroyed.
yeah,
Terrible.
yeah. I mean, so they're getting lots of help from North Korea. They're getting help from Iran. They're getting kind of indirect assistance from the Chinese, but China's not providing direct military assistance as far as we can tell. And so there is a question of, is there going to be a material limit, right? So there's the manpower issue, there's the material issue, and there's the money issue. Can the sanctions choke off the money that's paying for this war? And my own guess is that nothing is going to shift much in the next year to affect that, but maybe 2, 3 years out, Russia might finally hit the wall if the Ukrainians and the West can stay in it. And Putin's guessing that the Ukrainians in the West will cry uncle before he has to.
And crying uncle would probably mean Ukraine having to cede Crimea and Donbass, right? I mean, crying uncle doesn't mean Russia gets Kiev. Or that's the question, I guess, right?
Well, that's the long term goal. I mean, Putin has been pretty consistent that he wants to keep all the territory that they claim, not even territory that they currently control, but
That
territory
they
that they've
claim.
claimed.
Yeah.
That Ukraine would have to declare, eternal neutrality. Ukraine would have to reduce the size of its military to, I forget the number. It's like 50 to 80,000. One that would make it a sitting duck at any point in the future if he changed his mind, and that he wants some control over Ukrainian internal politics. That's what the whole denazification thing is about. It's about a pro-Russian government, Russian adopted as a state language equal to Ukrainian, all of those sorts of internal changes that most sovereign countries wouldn't accept, but he would like to impose if the war ends the way he envisions it.
Let's end with
That's pretty gloomy.
possibly upbeat question. Any potential for good news? Do you see any positives on the horizon?
Well, I mean, I guess the good news is that 2.5 years ago, no one would have expected that Ukraine would still be hanging in
No one.
against Russia. And I think a lot of people might not have expected that the US and its NATO allies would still be hanging in 2.5 years later. So the fact that Russia has not achieved its ultimate objectives is, in some sense, a victory, for Ukraine and for those supporting it. And I do think that this is maybe wishful thinking, but I do think in a couple of years, Russia might face some kind of cracks that force Putin to change direction. I
They
wouldn't sort of.
already owe me money for that bet about that building in Moscow, which
That,
which was still covered in shit 25 years later. So you want to make another bet on that one?
well, you know, Joel should also note that he owes me money on a bet
This
about
is
how
true.
the Russian foreign ministry would take down the hammer and sickle on the front of the
Oops.
building that's still
Oops.
there. Yeah.
I would
Um,
We
just
need
like
a
to note to
tiebreaker.
I'd like to note to the authorities that these are either mine bets or I have nothing to do with them whatsoever. So I want to make that perfectly clear in case anyone's listening.
yeah. So I don't want to engage
Yeah.
in wishful thinking, but I think if people are feeling some fatigue and asking, when will this end? I guess I would say, what makes you think it will end? Which is a sad state to be in. But I think that's where we are right now. And the question, I think, is in the 21st century, do we allow nuclear states to invade and recolonize their neighbors and, change global politics in a way we really haven't seen since the Second World War or not? I think, despite all the problems with U.S. foreign policy over the decades, that this is something beyond what has been sort of acceptable great power behavior in the post World War II era. And that's why I think it's important uh, to continue to help Ukraine fight to protect its sovereignty and its people. And I guess one final point I do want to make is that if the war is frozen, it doesn't mean it ends for Ukrainians, especially those in occupied territories who are subject to forced Russification, torture, rape, war crimes, etc. It just becomes a different type of conflict. It doesn't mean peace breaks out there.
Doesn't mean it ends. Yeah, we didn't even touch on the war crimes and all the rest, which just make this such a, a horrific conflict. Um, but maybe close out with this potential piece of hope, which comes with a little bit of irony. That on the 4th of July, perhaps the biggest hope we got came from the United Kingdom with its election, and maybe that will embolden progressives in France to hold off the far right, and maybe that's something that could spell trouble for the far right in the democracies, because in the end, that's what's going to be needed to hold together the support for Ukraine. Um, so maybe that's a little glimmer of hope. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. It's been so great to chat with you again. And
Thank you very much. It's been excellent.
Yeah,
yeah,
thanks, Joel and Brian. This has been really fun. Thank you.
yeah. All right. With that, thank you for joining us on another episode of the World Discord podcast. Thank you to Brian Taylor for joining us. On behalf of Brian Endless, thank you, Andy Miles, for producing, and we'll see you next time.
See you soon.